Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you watch political debate over the last couple of years, you've seen people using all sorts of different words and phrases like racism, white supremacy, white nationalism, and the rest. And today we're really going to spend some time talking about what are the origins of that. Now, many times those words are misused, but we're really going to try to give you a little bit of history. And I think for some of you, if you've never studied before, it's going to be a real surprise. Because to make the case very simply, if you want to understand where some of these ideas of racism come from, you only have to go back to a book very well known called The Origin of Species, that in its subtitle talked about favored races, and then a follow-up book by Charles Darwin on the descent of man. And so we're going to get into this in some detail, and we bring back to the microphone, first of all, Dr. Richard Weikart is Emeritus Professor of Modern European History at the California State University in Stanislaus. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. And you might remember in the past, we've talked about, for example, his book, From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany. We now have this new book out, which is called Darwinian Racism, and we have information about it on our website. Very readable, about 180 pages, and I would highly recommend the book to you. So, Dr. Richard Weikart, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Kerby.
In studio with me is my good friend, Dr. Ray Bohlin, who's the Vice President for Vision Outreach with Probe Ministries. Of course, he has multiple degrees from the University of North Texas, as well as a PhD from the University of Texas at Dallas, and is a research fellow with Discovery Institute Center for Renewal of Science and Culture. We have in the past, but it's been a long time ago, talked about the book he co-authored on Darwin's Racist. And as we go through this interview today, we'll talk about why we think this book also is a good companion to the one that we're talking about. But first of all, Ray, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Kerby.
I might just mention that you and Richard Weikart know each other, and you've read some of his other books, and you've got some questions about this one, don't you?
Yeah, well, I read From Darwin to Hitler after it first came out, and I thought the case was very well made, that Darwinism influenced Hitler greatly. And so, Dr. Weikart, I'm curious, in this book in particular, you take some time at the end of a few chapters to respond to certain individuals who don't have your opinion. And so I'm curious about what kind of feedback did you get from the book From Darwin to Hitler that prompted you to go in much greater detail in Darwinian racism?
Yeah, well, the book From Darwin to Hitler, actually, when I first started doing research on that book, I wasn't even thinking about Hitler, in fact. I was thinking about looking at evolutionary ethics in the late 19th century and how it had been a challenge to Christian ethics and such. And as I began researching, I started finding out that, these ideas that these people promoting evolutionary ethics are putting forward sound very similar to Nazi ideology. So that's why I brought the connection to Nazism there. Initially, but then once the book came out, the reviews were mixed. There were some, I did get some good reviews in the scholarly journals, but there were others who were negative. I think, again, largely the title put some people off. They didn't like the connection of Darwin and Hitler together. And so, that got under some people's skin, I think, and some people didn't read carefully what I was actually writing in the book either, and they misrepresented
Well, let me just mention real quickly that I think your book, first of all, really makes the case that indeed this idea of Nazism and white nationalism and white supremacy and the Nordic race and all that traces a good portion back to Darwin. Though, to be fair, you also point out Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and others are influential as well. So your book really kind of makes the case that this wasn't just Adolf Hitler's idea. It was entrenched in German society. Then I wanted to bring along Ray Bohlin, because the question that then people would have is, oh, well, that's just in Germany. And if you get into Ray's book, you get into how all these ideas of eugenics came over here, Margaret Sanger, eugenics, and all the rest. So we are going to have to cover quite a bit. But again, this idea of Darwinian racism is something that you wrote because you are convinced that we need to understand that Adolf Hitler actually got many of his ideas from Charles Darwin. True?
Exactly, and that's in my book From Darwin to Hitler. I'm actually the bulk of the book is covering pre-1914, so before Hitler was even involved in politics. I'm covering the ideologies that were being promoted, scientific racism. I show how people were talking about the Darwinian struggle for existence between races, about eugenics, about euthanasia, about other key ideas that Hitler was then going to pick up on. So yeah, these ideas were being promoted by biologists, anthropologists, leading figures in the scientific community. This is not just some harebrained idea by some wacko fringe folks that Hitler was getting his ideas from.
You know, honestly, that portion of the book, which is really most of it, took me a bit by surprise. I wasn't aware of how entrenched Nordic race advantages and superiority just basically infused academia in Germany before Hitler even came to power. And, you know, one of the things that is curious to me, I mean, one of the top, on the back of the book, you have a comment that was abbreviated here from Irving Hexham, and he says, excellent, ... terrifying, ... a must-read and long overdue. Well, it's curious to me because when I started, I got as another fellow with Discovery, I got an advanced copy of your book. So I was able to have it read before most people actually received it. And one of the phrases I used was terrifying. I mean, that you go into such great detail, and how entrenched this idea of Nordic race superiority was just infused in academia. That was quite surprising.
Yeah, and Kerby, I think, is right to point out that this is not just in Germany, although Germany, it may have been a little more entrenched than other places. And by the time the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, in the United States and Britain, the academic world was starting to turn away from those ideas, whereas Germany was becoming more entrenched in it because of the Nazi rule there. But still, if you go back before that time, in the 19-teens, 1920s, if you look at biology textbooks in the high schools, for example, they were teaching scientific racism.
Yeah. One of the things we point out in our book, Darwin's Racists, is that some 30 of the U.S. states, some 30 states, ended up passing laws with involuntary sterilization of anyone that they deemed was not fit to reproduce. And some of those were, like you said, in the teens and the 20s. And Hitler actually got some of his early ideas for the first laws from the U.S.
Yes, correct. The U.S. had these sterilization laws before Germany did. I should say, though, that the German eugenics movement was pretty powerful intellectually already at the same time. In fact, the Germans had the first eugenics society. The Germans had the first eugenics journal. So eugenics was very strong in Germany, even though they didn't have a law passed like in the United States for compulsory sterilization. Most of the ideas that Hitler got about eugenics were from German scientists.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into it a little bit more. I might just indicate, too, for those of you that would like to watch online, I'm going to show you at least one picture from a drawing by Ernst Haeckel and a couple others. It just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we are dealing with and what was prevalent there in Germany. Of course, all of that is in this book, Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Americans say they hate inflation, but many really like inflation, or at least they like the impact inflation has on their home values and other assets. We shouldn't be surprised at this ambivalence. When home prices rise, homeowners are encouraged and will even pat themselves on the back for making such a good investment. Rising home prices make them feel richer, even if the increase is due more to the money printing at the federal government. At the same time, rising home prices make it even less likely that younger Americans planning to be first-time home buyers will get into a home. And if they do get into a home, it will be smaller and more expensive than the one their parents owned. American homeowners may like rising house prices, but they don't like rising prices for gasoline or food at the grocery store. The people hurt the most are middle income and lower income Americans. A greater percentage of their income goes to food, energy, and shelter, and the latest consumer price index doesn't come close to measuring some of the costs that American families must pay each month. That's why inflation has become such a big issue in the 2022 midterm elections. I try to explain to the younger people in my radio audience what inflation was like in the 1970s. But you don't have to explain that to Joe Biden, who was elected to the Senate before Jimmy Carter was elected president. Jimmy Carter didn't cause inflation, but he inherited it and lost the next election. Joe Biden could argue that he didn't cause inflation but inherited it. That would be partially true, but he and Congress have been in a spending spree this year. That's why I predict that American voters will begin to express their frustration at the ballot box over rising prices. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Today, getting into the subject of racism and white supremacy and white nationalism. Where did that come from? Well, a lot of it all the way goes back to Charles Darwin. We'll get into that more in just a minute. But we are privileged to have with us today by phone Dr. Richard Weikart, and his book is entitled Darwinian Racism. We also have in studio with us Dr. Ray Bohlin and his book on Darwin's Racist. And before we go on, Ray, I know that you talk about that in your book, that there's a kind of an enigma here. Charles Darwin was a gentleman. He probably was a pretty good father and parent and spouse, and he was an abolitionist. He and the Wedgwoods and William Wilberforce actually wanted to end slavery, but the ideas that he promoted led immediately to the Eugenics Society, in which his cousin and then later his son were a part of that. So there's a difference between Darwin and then the ideas that unfold, wouldn't you say, in The Descent of Man?
Yeah, it really is a bit of a conundrum. He was very anti-slavery, as you said, an abolitionist, and his wife comes from the Wedgwood family. And so he married into that aspect of things, and as you said, was a gentleman, good father, as far as we can tell. But when he wrote The Descent of Man, and his ideas about different races of humans, and that when he started saying things like, in the future when chimps and gorillas go extinct and some of the lower, or what he called barbarian savage races of humans have been eliminated, then the gap's going to be much wider. It'll be between some descendant of the Aryan race that continue, or Caucasian actually evolves further, and a baboon. And he says, while at present, the gap is between the Negro and Aborigine and the gorilla.
Wow.
So how he can say that sort of thing and then be anti-slavery, those things tend to not mix very well.
Dr. Weikart, take us back to, of course, the first chapter of your book. What about this in terms of the Darwin's ideas before we get to Hitler? Can you explain those?
Yeah, in the first chapter of my book, I talk about Darwin's racism. And in fact, I don't think it was quite as unusual maybe as Ray thinks. I mean, I'm a historian, so I've looked more at the historical background here, but I don't think it was as unusual as you might think. There were actually a lot of abolitionists who were racists. In fact, I even came across one time an abolitionist who claimed that the reason that they wanted to abolish slavery was because they thought that the black Africans couldn't compete on a level playing field, and so they would lose out.
So we were enabling them by having them as slaves.
Yeah, exactly. That's how some people. So It wasn't that unusual for abolitionists to be racist. And basically, what Darwin did is he took the racism that was very prevalent in society and he integrated it into his theory, because Darwin had to show that there was variation within the human species. In fact, if you look at the origin of species, the first two chapters, the first one is on on variation under domestication. The second one is on variation in nature. And so he had to show variation, and racism served that purpose to show that there was variation in the human species.
But he didn't really address human evolution in Origin of Species.
Correct, but when he got to Descent of Man, he was still having to show needing to show variation to convince people of human evolution. So he's having to use the same rhetorical move that he did in Origin when he moved to Descent of Man. He has to show that there's lots of variation within the human species, and he has to try to show that there's little variation from one species to another. So from the apes to the humans, he has to show that there's less variation than most people think, and he has to show within the human species there's more variation than most people think.
Now, you had mentioned before we went to the break that even in some of the U.S. schools, the textbooks were promoting Darwinian racism, and you go into great detail in Darwinian Racism, your newest book, of how that was prevalent in the schools under Nazi rule in Nazi Germany. What's the comparison? How different would the textbooks have been in America than it would have been in Nazi Germany?
Well, like I suggested, in the United States, things were beginning to change by about the 1930s, even maybe in the 1920s a little bit in the higher echelons. But by the 1930s and 40s, racism was beginning to be phased out. Scientific racism, that is, was beginning to be phased out, some in the textbooks to some degree. But in Nazi Germany, of course, it's being reinforced. But if you look back at the 1920s, they'd be very similar in the United States and Germany and Britain. The scientific racism was being promoted. And what's interesting is that, whereas I suggested earlier that Darwin was going to integrate racism into his theory, after Darwinism became an established, accepted scientific theory, people did the exact opposite move. That is, they claimed that on the basis of Darwinism, racism must be true because things have evolved different ways in different places.
Yeah. Can you give us some example of what might have actually been the evidence that was presented in some of these textbooks, both in Germany and in the U.S.?
Sure. Well, a lot of it was based on what they saw as intellectual differences between, say, black Africans and white Europeans. So they said that the black Africans are living in these barbaric, uncivilized cultures and such, while the Europeans are, living with the science and all the other things that we have. And so they would look at the intellectual differences, and they would claim that shows the inferiority of the black Africans and the Aboriginal peoples in other parts of the world as well, the Native Americans, the Australian Aborigines, the New Zealand Maori and such. And so they saw them as being intellectually inferior. But interestingly, Darwin also thought they were morally inferior. He thought the Europeans were morally superior, that they developed sort of a moral sense that was superior also to the Aboriginal peoples.
Let me just mention for those of you, I encourage you, if you want to watch online, you can do that on Facebook or a number of others. I'm going to hold up just a picture that is from your book, and it shows 6, if you will, kind of human races, if you will, and then 6 races of animal or various apes. And Ray, one of the things that's so striking, and of course, Dr. Richard Weikart talks about it in his book, if you look at the most primitive looking human, it looks a lot like the most advanced looking ape. In other words, and these come from Ernst Haeckel. First of all, let's just, for a minute, since you're the scientist, talk about the fact that Haeckel's embryos, when we went through school, we learned ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, the embryos actually recapitulate evolution. Turns out that those diagrams that you see in almost any high school textbook were fraudulent. Yeah. And I get a sense that some of these diagrams are pretty fraudulent as well. And
I don't think he really mentions what species of apes he has pictured there. Maybe Dr. Weikart can help us out there. But even some of those human races, even that in that second row from the top, they look pretty ape-like too, almost all of them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But again, this was an attempt to just reinforce the idea that these lower races, these less favored races, were actually inferior. And so that justification, now this comes from Ernst Haeckel rather than Charles Darwin, just actually forces and reinforces and encourages this idea of racism because, after all, we recognize that it's the survival of the fittest, correct?
Exactly. And interestingly, Ernst Haeckel was actually a very accomplished artist, and he drew those diagrams himself. Okay. And he made them look as close as possible, as you're suggesting, that lowest human and the highest ape. I mean, the basic difference is one has hair and one has a little less, one has more hair and one has less hair. Otherwise, they look identical. And Haeckel did that on purpose. Yep. And interestingly, if you look at the caption to that photograph, that illustration, the caption actually states outright that the highest human is further from the lowest human than the lowest human is from the highest ape.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, again, you can see how that justifies racism. Just before I take a break, and we come back after the break, we will certainly open up for some questions, although we're going to talk a little bit more about what's in the schools and how that ended up in eugenics. But Dr. Ray Bohlin, I'm just thinking about, I think we have about 3 billion base pairs in the human DNA. Yeah. And we recognize that it's a fraction of a percent that have anything to do with any kind of racial characteristics. Yeah. So we now know that all this idea of race is really kind of ridiculous from scientific point of view. Yeah,
now that we know, and we've sequenced the human genome, and we've sequenced genome from all the different, not just races, but ethnic groups around the world, that there really is very little, if any, genetic difference between the races. It all has to do primarily with shape of the body and the face and skin color.
Yep. And again, that's kind of correlates with the Bible, because you see Paul talking about in Acts 17 that we're all of one blood. Mm-hmm. When you talk about the race, there's only one race, the human race. Yep. Anyway, let's take a break. By the way, that's supposedly controversial now, but almost everything is. We're going to come back and continue our conversation. This book is one that I would recommend if you really want to understand, where did this idea of racism come from? Well, Darwinian racism, how Darwinism influenced Hitler, Nazism, and white nationalism. We'll come back and talk about, are there white nationalists today? Do they still use some of these ideas? Again, I think you'll be surprised. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson,
Continue our conversation today as we focus our time and attention on the book Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. Let me just mention that we have information about the book. It's now out, and so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. Also, we've been talking about Dr. Ray Bohlin's book as well, Darwin's Racist, which has been out for many years, and we have a link to that as well. If you want more information, of course, we have this booklet that we've made available on racism, which we have a small section about Charles Darwin's books, Origin of Species, as well as The Descent of Man and the Selection in Relation to Sex, and how the Eugenics Society was first founded by Francis Galton, who was the half-cousin of Charles Darwin. Later, then his own son, Leonard Dalt of Darwin, used it, and so we get some of that information out there. Ray Bohlin in studio, Dr. Weikart by phone. But the subtitle is interesting, White Nationalism. Again, both of us have been writing a little bit on this subject, but I think you shocked both of us to realize how much Darwinian ideas were instrumental, and to this day are instrumental to white nationalists. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, I was a little surprised as well. I mean, it shouldn't have been maybe a surprise because the white nationalists are inheriting sort of the neo-Nazi mantle, so it shouldn't be surprising they're recycling ideas that the Nazis were using. But I really was a little surprised at how much they were using Darwinian arguments. In the course of my research for this book, I examined a large variety of white nationalist, alt-right, neo-Nazi websites and publications. And what I found is that many of them are promoting Darwinian racism. That is, they're claiming that, let me just give you a couple quotations from Richard Spencer, who caught a lot of press attention about 5 years ago or so. Spencer was considered the leader, one of the key leaders of the alt-right movement. He published Radix Journal. He said, quote, "Racial differences are a natural and normal consequence of human evolution." And then he said, quote, "The preference for one's own race is a product of our evolutionary history." So not only do they think races have evolved at different levels, but if he thinks that they buy into this evolutionary psychology idea that the evolutionary process has made us want to promote our own race. And so they see racism itself as being a product of evolution. And this is not uncommon. Again, this is a very widespread idea. In fact, one of the things I start off my book with is the Columbine High School shooting in 1999.
Powerful.
Because Eric Harris, who was a white nationalist, was doing this deed on Hitler's birthday in honor of Hitler and showing his connections with Nazis. But he also was wearing a T-shirt that said "natural selection" on it when he went out and carried out his dastardly killing. Wow. And so if you read his journals, and I've read his journals where he talks about his innermost ideas, and Darwinism does play a very key role in his thinking about life and about racism.
You know, that comment you just made in passing is worth delving into for just a minute, and that is that you would want to breed in your own race. Again, that's why I have a scientist in here. It seems to me that if you didn't know anything about genetics, and let's face it, Darwin did not, you know, that came later, you would think that you would want to actually have all whites breed with whites, and that the closer you could breed with your people, and maybe even your class, the better off you would be. From a biological point of view, that's a disaster, isn't it?
Yeah, they didn't know about inbreeding at that point in time, and it surprises me even today that these white nationalists would be talking that way.
Yes,
because we now know that when you stay within your tribe or your family, incest is outlawed, and even beyond that, we know that if you stay too close to your own genetic structure, that's called inbreeding, and that will have negative effects on your offspring eventually. And now we know that if you're breeding with someone from way outside of your, or marrying or reproducing with someone outside of your tribe area, well, your children tend to be a bit more fit because that blending is actually advantageous.
Yes. So again, just some of the things, Dr. Richard Weikart, that were promoted there by Darwin are still being promoted today by white nationalists. It's just one of those head-shaking kind of ideas. But since we are running short, go ahead.
And interestingly, it goes right through Hitler's Mein Kampf, because Hitler in Mein Kampf specifically discussed the issue of blending inheritance, and he claimed that it was going to put you, if you take someone from a higher race and intermarry with someone from a lower race, that this puts them in the middle between those two races, and he said that then the one in the middle is going to get destroyed by the higher one because they're going to outcompete them.
Yes, and so you can see the breeding experiments, you can see the Holocaust, but let's broaden that, because one of the other chapters you deal with is eugenics, and that shows up in your book as well as in Ray Bohlin's book, because today we don't hear about it. Matter of fact, if I say the word eugenics in front of a group of students, they go, I don't even know what that means, but it's the idea that you want to breed human beings the way you would breed horses or cattle or anything else, and we want to make sure that the unfit do not reproduce. And Ray talked about the fact that we actually had all these voluntary sterilization laws. And in your book, you quote at one point, Ray Bohlin, this is the Chief Justice of the United States.
Yes.
Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said,
when one of those laws was challenged, his comment to the plaintiffs was basically 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
It's just amazing. And that was from the Supreme Court, by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So, Richard Weikart, talk about eugenics, first in Germany. We'll talk about it in the United States, because that really underscores and was the foundation for so much of what Hitler wanted to do, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and it was based, again, upon the biological idea that we need to get rid of those who are unfit. And interestingly, some people say, well, eugenics isn't natural selection. Eugenics is artificial selection, so that's not really Darwinian. But what's interesting is that they were basing it upon the Darwinian idea of natural selection in this way. The eugenicists were claiming that modern civilization had set aside natural selection by helping the weak, by building, places to care for the poor and the sick and the weak, and that therefore the sick and weak were then multiplying. And so we need to offset that by eugenics, by artificial selection, to select those who are fit and get rid of those who are unfit one way or another. And usually that way was by things like compulsory sterilization, which you've already mentioned. But of course, the Nazis were going to ratchet that up even a notch by going into their so-called euthanasia program beginning in 1939. They were going to out and out kill people with disabilities to try to get rid of people that they saw as biologically weak and inferior, who they didn't think were fit for the Darwinian struggle for existence.
Yeah, the Nazis really didn't start their eugenics practices by rounding up Jews and sending them to gas chambers. They kind of went through a gradual process. Can you elaborate that for us?
Yeah, well, the first thing that the Nazis did in terms of eugenics was in 1933, July of 1933, Hitler passed his compulsory sterilization law, which was going to compulsory sterilize people just like it was going in the United States. Now, although it was in many respects like the American laws, it was much more fanatically applied. They sterilized approximately, somewhere between 300 and 400,000 people in 6 years. So that's like 1 out of every 20 Germans was sterilized during that time period. So this is a massive thing they're trying to do. And then in 1939, once World War II broke out and Hitler had sort of the cover of war, he began out and out killing people with disabilities. And by the time the war ended, the Germans had killed about 200,000 Germans, plus tens of thousands of mentally and physically disabled people in the occupied territories. And this is not just Hitler's idea, by the way. He had psychiatrists on board with this. He had people, a lot of physicians who were promoting this idea. His personal physician was behind this program, Karl Brandt. And Karl Brandt was unrepentant, in fact, in this trial after the war, was unrepentant, saying that what they were doing was a good thing by killing all these people.
Incredible. Let me take a break, but I might just mention that it eventually makes its way over here through Margaret Sanger. Her book, The Pivot of Civilization, refers to the elimination of human weeds, and that's in Ray's book, and the segregation of morons, misfits, and the maladjusted. And so anybody that thinks that those ideas just stayed in Germany, that's why we also wanted to mention Ray Bohlin's book, Darwin's Racism, that talks about some of that in this country, including, of course, the Supreme Court precedents and all sorts of other things. And for those of you that say, wait a minute, you're saying some things I have never heard before, just go to Wikipedia right now if you want to and go to Buck versus Bell. That was the Supreme Court case. And that's where the Chief Justice of the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes, considered one of the great jurists of the 20th century, said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And if you don't wonder about the toxicity of these ideas, well, then we haven't done a very good job. But when we come back, we'll pick up a few more ideas in the book Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. That coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the book Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. Previous book, which I also would recommend to you, From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany. And in a sense, Dr. Richard Weikart, for just a minute, we should talk about the fact that this still has an impact. There would be a tendency for people to read either of these books and think, well, that was Germany. None of those ideas show up any longer. But again, the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, these ideas of white nationalism still have a place. And when you start talking about issues like eugenics or euthanasia or racism or white supremacy, some of those do have a root, and that's why we really wanted to talk about that. And I know that's why you wrote these books in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I was interested in the way that these things played out historically, and obviously in the Nazi period. And my book, Darwinian Racism, is showing during the Nazi period how the Nazis relied upon Darwinism in a very strong way. But yeah, I'm also concerned about the way that the implications that Darwinism has for today. And if you look at the white nationalist scene, and my last chapter examines it in detail, they are still recycling these same Darwinian ideas, claiming that races are unequal because they have varied in their evolutionary past, and that they're locked in a struggle for existence, and that and many of them find this evolutionary psychology idea that that because of our evolutionary past, we favor people of our own race.
And again, we should be paying attention to that. Let me just mention real quickly, because I don't want to go the entire hour and not mention the Discovery Institute. Yeah. So that's discovery.org. And of course, you are a senior fellow at Discovery Institute. Ray is, again, also a research fellow, and it's a great organization. Of course, people will probably remember when we had all sorts of other speakers speaking on the issue of intelligent design, economics, education, and the rest. But Ray, when we get into the book, there's some really important issues that you've been able to glean out of there, aren't there?
Well, we talk about the racism that's Darwinian racism that's present today, and you mentioned that Margaret Sanger was indeed a racist and promoted eugenics. And in one of her books, she actually states this: "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members."
Wow.
Now, if you get the current edition of Sanger's book, that's not there.
Isn't that interesting?
Some of those things have been taken out. And one of the big critics today of some of that is Dr. Alveda King, who is Martin Luther King Jr.'s niece. Mm-hmm. And she's an author and teacher, taught at university. And one of the things she said is that Planned Parenthood is definitely a racist organization. They have a racist agenda. Since 1970, there has been something like 50 million abortions, and 17 million of those have been blacks. It's black genocide. They are killing our people and fooling us. So this isn't just a far-out idea. Dr. Alveda King has made this point repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. She was, as a matter of fact, I've been on this program. She just recently was speaking just a few miles away from here at the capital of the state of Texas on the pro-life issues. And so, Richard Weikart, that's one of the reasons why I'm going to come back to you, because you would not only talk about how this is showing up in these areas of white nationalism, but these ideas sort of have their own currency. And there aren't people right now pushing eugenics, but they are pushing physician-assisted suicide. They're pushing the idea of euthanasia. They're talking about the fact that maybe we need to eliminate some opportunities for individuals because we might just be perpetuating weak parts of our society. Those Darwin ideas still have, it's almost like zombie science. Jonathan Wells talks about that. These ideas just never really go away, do they?
That's right. And even though I'm focusing on racism more in this book, the issues of eugenics, the issues of euthanasia are all still out there. And I do in the chapter on eugenics, I do talk about eugenics and euthanasia because ultimately, when you buy into a Darwinian view of life, that everything is the product of chance events that have taken place over eons of time, then it's hard to see how humans have any special status. And Darwin himself stated this. Darwin himself stated that there's no qualitative difference between animals and humans. He said there's only a quantitative difference. We just have a little bit more rationality, a little bit more of this, a little bit more of something else. But the animals have that too, and so there's no real qualitative distinction. And once you erase that qualitative distinction between humans and animals, then humans are not special. We're not created in the image of God. We're not we don't have any special status anymore, and this sort of erases what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, where he said that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So under Darwinism, you no longer have that. And there's some Darwinists that are admitting that point blank, by the way. Yuval Harari, in his recent book, Sapiens, makes that very argument. He says humans are not created equal, they're unequal, and they're promoting these and on the basis of his Darwinian thinking, he promotes these ideas. If you think about someone like Peter Singer at Princeton University, he's not a racist, but he is promoting euthanasia, assisted suicide, abortion, infanticide, all of those on the basis of his Darwinian worldview that claims that humans are not distinct from animals.
And I might just mention, Dr. Ray Bohlin, in your book at the very end, you talk about cloning, genetic engineering, all sorts of things. Because if there is no distinction between humans and animals, and we're just maybe a qualitative distinction, a quantitative distinction, qualitative, no real difference, but just a bigger brain size or whatever. Well, if you genetically engineer animals, why can't you genetically engineer human beings? We can clone animals. Why can't we clone human beings? If we have an overpopulation of deer, we issue a hunting license, and maybe we can do some things to reduce human population. You can begin to see that you march down that road in terms of medical ethics. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, and you've written a lot about that. That is dangerous when you blur the distinctions between humans and animals.
Absolutely, and it's already happening here in the United States. Numerous fertility specialists will allow you to choose the gender of your child, and that means whatever embryos you have formed for the in vitro fertilization, they can easily test whether they're male or female, and if it's not the right sex that you want, well, they just kind of say we discard those, or freeze them away, and usually those just die in the freezer anyway. And there's also a fertility specialist I don't want to name. This is still in progress, but he has spoken of the fact that he has the ability to choose the eye color from the embryo.
Oh boy.
So if you want blue eyes or green eyes or brown eyes, well, he can make sure that your child's going to have the right color eye that you want.
No, this is the kind of thing that Adolf Hitler dreamed of. Dr. Richard Weikart, a fascinating book. And again, I encourage people to go to discovery.org because you also have a very good essay there on Darwinian racism, which is also very valuable. And we have information about you and about the book on our website at pointofview.net. Again, Darwinian Racism, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. It's been a delight to have you on the program again, so thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's been great talking with you.
And again, Ray Bohlin, thank you for coming in here. And we not only mentioned his book on Darwinian racism, but also Darwin's Racist, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And a lot of great material. A link to the website at probe.org. So thank you for being here as well.
Always a pleasure, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and then we have lots of issues in the news to talk about today. And so we will get into that. Of course, Ukraine. Of course, we had a State of the Union address last night. We'll talk about that. And, of course, give you a chance to ask a question, make a phone call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break and be back with more right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic. I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to give you a little more perspective on this idea of racism, but let's get back into issues in the news. And again, if you go to our website, you will see a couple of articles. One from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, Biden misses the moment. I'll get to that in just a minute. And then a very lengthy one, and I do mean lengthy. I printed it out, and 27 pages worth. But we'll go through some of that. What Biden got wrong in his State of the Union address, which, first of all, got to make you smile. Whether you agree with Peter Paris and the Daily Signal or not, and of course this is associated with the Heritage Foundation, you got to say, when it takes 27 pages to actually talk about what the president got wrong on the State of the Union address, whether you agree with all the critique or not, you got to say, okay, there's quite a bit, and I will spare you going through all of it, but just at least to help you understand that there were some things that any fair-minded individual might raise their eyebrows at and say, really? I don't think so, and we'll give you some of that in just a minute. But I think we have to recognize all of this is happening at the same time, and the big question we always have around Point of View is, what do you cover? We just yesterday had an election in the state of Texas. Now you will be in your states, if you're not in Texas, and most of you are not, will be having elections that will happen in May, June, or July, but because this one was so early, gave us some indications of what might happen in some of the midterm elections in terms of the primaries. So I won't probably even have a chance to talk about that today, but we might get to it by the Friday weekend edition. We also, of course, have Ukraine taking place. So let me, for a few minutes, talk about the latest from Ukraine, which is very sad, but I wanted to give you some material and some perspective that perhaps you'll hear nowhere else. And I hope that as you hear it, you evaluate it yourself. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You can look for other pieces of information, but my goal here is to at least try to help you kind of put it in perspective. First of all, the claim from Ukraine of 6,000 Russian casualties, it would be tempting to think that the Ukrainians are winning, but let's recognize that we have military in Ukraine from Russia. Now we have military in from Belarus, although it's doubtful how much they will be involved in the fighting, but you just can never predict anything in that regard. And part of it is just the sheer numbers, because you have nearly 200,000 Russian troops either in Ukraine or are approaching Ukraine, which, as a few people have said, for every Russian soldier who's killed or captured or even surrenders, the Russians can send two more. So this is an attrition game, if you will. But I think all of us, including Vladimir Putin and the Russian generals, have been shocked at the level of Ukrainian resistance. So let's give credit where credit is due. This is not what they expected at all, which will lead me in just a minute to what I think is what has become a very bloody battle, because now the bombing of civilians, it's interesting because I've produced a booklet that will be printed shortly and then be sent out on just war. One of the aspects of just war and modern warfare is non-combatant immunity, but there seems to be little concern at all No surprise there from Russians, but also we've seen this in the past with terrorists as well. How can we evaluate some of this? I'm going to give you a couple of different quotes, but this one comes from Ben Wallace, who is the Secretary of State for Defense in the UK. He says, what you are seeing now are those heavy bombardments at night. They won't come into cities as much. They will, I'm afraid, as we've seen tragically carpet bomb cities indiscriminately in some cases. They will fly at night rather than daytime because what we've seen is they get shot down in the daytime. They will slowly but surely try and surround the cities, then either bypass them or bombard them. That is the brutality, he says, that I'm afraid we're witnessing, and is going to get worse. I've warned before, the Russian doctrine is to get harder and tougher and more indiscriminate. So what has been reported in some places needs to be reemphasized. This is just horrific. This is truly an evil empire. And yet, even off air, we've had some people talking about some people that seem even to this hour be supporting Vladimir Putin and the Russians and all that. Now, I love the Russian people. I got neighbors across the street that are from Russia. That's not the point. We're not against Russians. We are against the Russian leader and the Russian military that are killing people indiscriminately. You have all sorts of people making predictions. Take them with a bag of salt. But okay, this comes from a U.S. intelligence assessment that points to Russian victories in April or May. If you look at your calendar, you know it's March. So again, they're actually saying, this is a report that went to CBS News, that the tactical seizure of Ukraine possibly within the next 4 to 6 weeks. But what does that mean? The possibility of a bloody insurgency that could last for some time. After all, you have 44 million people in Ukraine that will probably never forget what Vladimir Putin and the Russian military have done to their country. And so, as one of the commentators put it, given the durability of the Ukrainian resistance and its long history of pushing Russia back, the U.S. and Western powers do not believe that this will be a short war. The UK Foreign Secretary estimated it would be a 10-year war. My goodness, let's hope not. Lawmakers at the Capitol were told Monday that it's likely to last 10, 15, 20 years and that ultimately Russia will lose. Oh, my goodness. That's not exactly what anybody expected. And when you think about the kinds of conflict we've talked about on this program before, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, all the rest. We've had a lot of horror stories, but you can begin to recognize that even though Vladimir Putin maybe naively thought that he would come into the country and he would be greeted with open arms, and one of our callers the other day reminded us that that was the case. You know, if you go out to those eastern provinces of Ukraine, which are much more pro-Russian, they were greeting them. That's not exactly what the Russian military has run into as they've moved further to the west. But nevertheless, that is the case. And of course, we also yesterday spent some time talking about the fact that these economic sanctions are doing their job. They are crushing the Russian people. I'm not sure how much it's crushing the oligarchs, although we'll get into some of the comments made last night by the president in that regard. But the Moscow stock market is still closed. Russia is defaulting on most of its government bonds that are held by foreign investors. And at one point, the ruble was worth a penny. So, and also, of course, I just mentioned the president last night, Russian airlines will not be able to fly into this airspace and will not be able to fly internationally. And the long-term implication of some of that is, will that feed such an animosity that you get some kind of backlash? This last hour, of course, we were talking about Nazi Germany. That came in large part because of some of the restrictions placed on Germany after World War I. So we need to learn that lesson, but we need to take a break. We come back. If you would like to, go to the website, pointofview.net. We're going to look at these two articles, some of the places where Joe Biden, the president, missed the mark, and maybe some of the mistakes he made in his presentation. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Americans say they hate inflation, but many really like inflation, or at least they like the impact inflation has on their home values and other assets. We shouldn't be surprised at this ambivalence. When home prices rise, homeowners are encouraged and will even pat themselves on the back for making such a good investment. Rising home prices make them feel richer, even if the increase is due more to the money printing at the federal government. At the same time, rising home prices make it even less likely that younger Americans planning to be first-time home buyers will get into a home. And if they do get into a home, it will be smaller and more expensive than the one their parents owned. American homeowners may like rising house prices, but they don't like rising prices for gasoline or food at the grocery store. The people hurt the most are middle income and lower income Americans. A greater percentage of their income goes to food, energy, and shelter, and the latest consumer price index doesn't come close to measuring some of the costs that American families must pay each month. That's why inflation has become such a big issue in the 2022 midterm elections. I try to explain to the younger people in my radio audience what inflation was like in the 1970s. But you don't have to explain that to Joe Biden, who was elected to the Senate before Jimmy Carter was elected president. Jimmy Carter didn't cause inflation, but he inherited it and lost the next election. Joe Biden could argue that he didn't cause inflation but inherited it. That would be partially true, but he and Congress have been in a spending spree this year. That's why I predict that American voters will begin to express their frustration at the ballot box over rising prices. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's get to the State of the Union address, and if you'd like to join our conversation today, maybe you had a chance to watch it, maybe heard about that, maybe have some comments, pro or con, love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk mostly about substance. Going to talk about style for just a minute. It is time for the Republican leadership to find some way to condemn, censor, or something. Last night, Lauren Boebert actually heckled the president. That is inappropriate. I don't care if it comes from a Republican or a Democrat. Doesn't matter if it is a member of Congress or somebody in the audience or press corps. That needs to stop. And, of course, we've had other examples of that in the past. Either we need to change the rules, and after all, if you've ever lately had a chance to listen to the Canadian Parliament, or even worse so, the British Parliament, as people speak, they go, and sometimes there's booing and all sorts of stuff, and there was some of that last night. But we've always argued that we want to have decorum in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate, which to this very day is why even if you hate the guts of the person across the aisle, you still say, this is the esteemed senator from Delaware, the esteemed senator from Alaska, whatever it might be. And so we are getting to a point where any kind of rule is being broken. I, of course, experienced that for years on college campuses where students could interrupt you, professors would interrupt you, oftentimes just to throw you off your game. But either we're going to have something that looks like a rugby match, or else let's go back to having something that looks like a tennis match. Are you with me on that? I'm going to have more to say about that in just a minute, because I also believe it is time to condemn some of the other individuals, Marjorie Taylor Greene and all that, especially since we've been talking about white supremacy today. But that I will leave to the end of the program, because those are all sort of style issues, but they're important. And I just wanted to say that in case any of you had some thoughts about that. But what about substance? We tend to spend more time on substance because, again, you can say nasty things about me or about anybody else, but what are you going to do to bring about some kind of change that is going to help the American people? And again, I tend to put a lot of this through a filter called your faith, your family, or your freedom. And when we look at the kind of challenge that President Biden faced, or let's think about it in a different way, the challenge that maybe his speech writers faced, how in the light of the last 2 years do you put any kind of face on the State of the Union address? I mean, when it was 2 years ago, there was a lot of celebration by President Donald Trump. Even if indeed Nancy Pelosi tore up his notes, there was still a sense in which the economy was doing pretty well. But then we've had the pandemic, the lockdown. Then since Biden has been into office, we've got all sorts of things, from the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan to inflation to 2 million people crossing the border, on and on and on and on. So you would think, in the light of the fact that a lot of this last year has not gone so well under his administration, that you might change a policy course somewhere. And that brings us to the first article by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because they said he pretty much missed a moment. The president remained on the same policy course of his first year, maybe dressing it up in new anti-inflation packaging. Here's what they said. More defense spending to meet the threats of autocrats, from autocrats? No. A new appreciation for the contribution of fossil fuels to the American and European security? Not a word. A note that government spending contributed to the highest inflation in 40 years? Nope. A word of praise for the private pharma innovation that developed COVID therapies and vaccines? Actually proposed government price controls instead. You think about all the things that could have been said, and not one of them. He did, in the second paragraph, they talk about, did offer a stirring support for Ukraine and fight for freedom, which received bipartisan applause. So let's give some positives there. His administration deserves credit for helping to rally Europe and other nations to impose sanctions and provide more military aid, and he was properly condemning Vladimir Putin. So good. But again, he said his self-congratulation ignored the failure to deter the Russian autocrat. Quote, we were ready, he says. Well, it doesn't look like we were, but okay. But if the United States had been ready, Mr. Putin wouldn't have invaded. The Russian invaded because he thought the United States would do little, and Vladimir Putin finds himself in a struggle now because of the bravery of the 41 million Ukrainians, not the strength of Europe or the United States. He also says what we didn't hear was a vow that Russia would not be allowed to conquer and hold Ukraine. There was no warning to Putin not to launch missiles into residential neighborhoods, which we just talked about a minute ago, or to surround and starve cities into submission like a medieval siege. This was not Harry Truman at the dawn of the Cold War calling the world to meet the new danger. Then on his domestic agenda, of course, Mr. Biden acknowledged inflation, as he had to because of the polls, but he blamed rising prices on the pandemic, greedy businesses, and the solutions are to unleash prosecutors and antitrust cops and to spend even more money on social programs and entitlements. His most otherworldly line was that his program would cut the energy cost for families an average of $500 a year by combating climate change. And of course, the whole point, as they say, of the climate agenda is to raise the price of energy for Americans, reducing the supply, increasing the cost, and causing more and more of the economy to move to any kind of alternative sources. So this first article, I think, was pretty fair from the Wall Street Journal, and looking at that particular message that was given by the president. But then the piece that is going on for pages is, again, this piece which we've also posted. And if you want to print it out, and I would recommend it, I'll hold it up here and you can see how thick it is. 27 pages worth of what Biden got wrong in the State of the Union address. And you may agree or disagree with some of those, but it gives you kind of some talking points by an individual that really wanted to take on the issues. Let me just pick out a few. I'm not going to wear you out. We just have too many other things to talk about today, but I thought it would be appropriate to mention, first of all, that when you look at the economy, you would hope that this president would have said, maybe it is time to scale back some of our spending in light of inflation. You would hope you would hear that, but not the case. Peter Parasai actually says it this way: President Joe Biden positions himself as a champion of workers, families, small business, pledging to reduce household expenses and nurture entrepreneurs and foster good paying jobs. But if you take away the rhetoric of some of that and see what is happening, you are talking about a massive spending agenda that ignores policy reforms that might actually benefit you, the American people. Missing from the president's address was any meaningful plan to curb and to ease the crushing regulatory burden that constitutes an enormous tax on the entire American people. If you go back and type in, for example, under the commentaries that I've written, regulatory burden or just regulations, you will see that there are various individuals, both liberal and conservative, very conservative think tanks and fairly liberal think tanks, or certainly left of center think tanks, that all pretty much point out that there is, if you will, sort of a hidden tax, a regulatory tax that are on the American people. And at a time when I am going to make a firm commitment to the fact that our prices of gas are going to go up. Yesterday, remember, we talked about it was at 104, 106. I saw one today, it was $111 a barrel. You can figure that out because, first of all, next time you go to the gas pump, you're going to be paying a lot more. But as I've tried to point out on this program before, it isn't just the cost of gasoline for you, but everything else that you use comes from gasoline or diesel. It's in the trucks that bring the food to your home or to your grocery store or even to the restaurant. It's the individuals that are driving from place to place, getting the equipment and the supplies necessary to meet some of your needs. And so that is the case. And ultimately, even as we talk about the need for infrastructure to actually be addressed, repairs, they say in this article here, to the nation's roads, bridges, airports, railroads will actually be slowed and are much more costly because of some of the regulatory flaws that actually exist. And the other day I heard somebody explaining to me in one of the places where we were actually doing a presentation on how easy it used to be to actually build a bridge and how difficult it is to do so, how easy it used to be to put a road in, how difficult it is now just because of some of these regulatory demands, many of which are conflicting, so they aren't necessarily helping the environment. They're just actually making it more difficult to get just about anything done. So that's on the issue of the economy. When we come back, I'll pick out a couple of other of the flaws that were in the State of the Union address. Maybe you have some thoughts as well. 1-800-351-1212. And if you would like to read this in its entirety, we've posted it on the website at pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let's continue for just a few more minutes talking about the President's State of the Union address. This particular piece goes into incredible detail into some of the things that were missed opportunities. And there are always times in which you listen to a State of the Union address and you not only pay attention to what is said, but what is not said. And it is interesting to see some of the things that were hardly mentioned. China being one of those who I think China is a much greater threat than even Russia is, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But if you talk about the threat in terms of the world economy and the actions that are being done right now by Xi Jinping and China, that certainly would deserve more attention. And of course would be there if indeed they already decided to invade Taiwan, which sadly I still suspect is a possibility. So those are some issues. And then you always have some boilerplate ideas that are presented that have not a snowflake's chance of being passed, but they're said there anyway. The typical way that a State of the Union address is put together is these initial comments are made and suggested outline. Then they're sent around to the various cabinet officers, and every one of them vie to try to get their particular issue into the legislation, or actually into the speech, so that it becomes legislation, and as a result ends up looking like a wish list half the time. But nevertheless, you can see that if indeed we're concerned about inflation, then you would hope that the president might understand that wage and price controls, those have been tried before, both by Republicans and Democrats, are not a good idea. If you recognize that people are going to be paying more for gas and more for food, you might want to address some of those issues. And what was oftentimes completely ignored or mentioned just in passing really is front and center for the American people. The first couple of pages of this talk about how either the president doubled down on bad ideas on inflation or tiptoed around the cost of rising prices for food. And given the fact that almost every survey says number one on the list is inflation, by the way, number two on the list is immigration, you can see that is the case. A couple things are counterintuitive. For example, the president at one point said the American people will, and the United States government will, buy American to make sure everything from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the steel on highway guardrails is made in America. As much as that brings a cheer, guess what? There are a lot of people that simply say that it could actually hurt the military, because when we try to constrain free trade, limit our purchases to certain kinds of things which could maybe only be made in America but can be made much cheaper in other countries, I think we really run into a very significant wall, and we'll see where that goes. I suspect Congress may not go along with that anyway, but we'll see. And then, of course, we look at the fact that, yes, let's give credit where credit is due. The sanctions have been implemented, but there are many people, including us around this table, that said, why didn't we implement the sanctions before Russia came rather than once they were in the country of Ukraine? The argument always was, well, this provides a possible deterrent, a threat. Well, I'd rather have the deterrent come before we actually see people shooting. That's not where it went. Then you have a whole statement or two about the relation to China, what many people have called China bills, but he didn't really mention that, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And these are part of what's called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which actually are pieces of legislation that are supposed to counter the threat from China, but they end up giving away hundreds of billions of dollars to special interest and big companies and others that already have the motivation and the money to make the investments themselves. So that could actually be justified as nothing more than some kind of pork barrel spending, and so that is the case. But it has been interesting to see how little was said about China. The best way they described it in this particular article that we've posted, China was all but missing in action in the speech. And I love the way they put it here. The writer says President Joe Biden gave his first State of the Union address Tuesday evening. In his roughly hour-long speech, He talked about Ukraine extensively and ran through a litany of programs and issue areas, from a $15 an hour minimum wage to border issues to fighting cancer, but made almost no mention of China. Again, I think you can learn as much by what isn't said as but what is said. Again, the financial investments, not only of the Biden family, but of many members of Congress in China. The fact that it is seen as a tremendous market is one of the reasons why you almost never see Hollywood, you never see the NBA, you never see major companies say anything critical of what has been taking place in China in terms of human rights and all of the rest. Well, let's, if we can, one other real point, this might be kind of picky, but you have got to remember that the State of the Union address is vetted by multiple individuals. I know that sometimes, every once in a while, I'll have a mistake show up in one of my commentaries, but it's not vetted by the entire apparatus of the United States federal government. But when the president made the statement that the federal government spends $600 billion a year to keep the country safe and secure, if he was referring to the Defense Department, he's off by $140 billion right off the bat. But nevertheless, you know, those are picky issues, but relevant because they sort of make you wonder, especially at one point when the president was talking about the fact that Putin is never going to actually win over the hearts of the Iranians. Except he meant the Ukrainians. And, you know, those little things do tend to surface every once in a while, make you wonder what's going on. A couple other runs real quickly. When we talk about the border, he again talked about the fact that Congress needs to beat the opioid epidemic. I agree. And but I think one of the ways to do that is to secure the border. That's not the kind of thing that was mentioned. You did spend about using technology at ports of entry to prevent drug smuggling. But again, a lot of those drugs aren't coming from the ports. They're coming from the borders between the ports, right? And they're coming from the south, and you are seeing very little discussion about that is all. Some of you might say, well, I've, matter of fact, hoped that the president would finally say the mask mandates and restrictions are over. Well, it sure seemed to me like it's still kind of March 2020 instead of March 2022. So a lot of people had some things to say about that. While we're talking about health care, under the Affordable Care Act that was implemented under President Barack Obama and, of course, Vice President Joe Biden, now called Obamacare, premiums for individual health insurance have more than doubled, and more than half of all U.S. counties have 2 or fewer insurers selling coverage. So we have to address this issue of health care, and we also have to figure out how we're going to fund Medicare, because if we don't do anything at all, eventually we'll be unable to pay some of those benefits. A couple more, and then we'll move on to some other topics. Federal subsidies to solve the college problem. There's no way in which that's probably going to take place, but again, those are thrown in to make everybody feel good. Some things talking about the expansion of the welfare state for per-child credits and all sorts of things. Maybe that will happen. We'll have to see what happens in the Senate. And, of course, during a midterm election, most of those things probably will not actually see the light of day. Perhaps the most disturbing was the fact that, once again, this president makes it sound like when it comes to voting and elections, here's the quote, President Biden continued his assault on the idea that there is a right to vote and it's now under assault. And he insulted legislators and voters in many states, according to this article, that have passed beneficial election reforms, when he claimed that these reforms actually are intended to suppress the vote and subvert entire elections. I haven't gotten to it, but today we actually did look at what happened last night, and I'm not seeing just a whole lot of people rush into microphones saying that because we required people to have a photo ID, that prevented them from being able to vote in the state of Texas. And yet all sorts of predictions of doom and catastrophe were talked about by the president and have been talked about for some time. Voter suppression, it's a great line. It's not based upon much of anything, but nevertheless, we can certainly understand that if you want to try to get people out to vote, You want to try to use as much as you can to make people fear that there would be voter suppression. But I suspect that when it's all said and done, when we look at some of these very important laws that were implemented already in Texas, in the future, which will be implemented in Georgia and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and other places where those have taken place, all the hue and cry about voter suppression may fade just a little bit. Come back, I'll mention a little bit about criminal justice and abortion, two other issues, and then we'll move on to some other topics because there is a lot to cover. And if you didn't have a chance to watch the State of the Union address, probably spent more time talking about it than you wanted to know, but I wanted you to know that there are some ways to fact check what actually was said last night. And we're doing what I'm afraid a lot of the mainstream press isn't willing to do. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me again encourage you to get a couple of the articles, and one of those is this very detailed analysis of the State of the Union address. And if indeed you'd like to know a little bit more, maybe even use this to ask some questions of those individuals that are asking for your vote. I've said before, when they ask you for your vote, you should ask them some questions first. And of course, we've talked about everything from the economy to defense. Let me real quickly talk about a couple of others, then we'll go on to some other topics. But one of those is, of course, the criminal justice system. After all these months of hearing defund the police, it is, I think, important to recognize that the president, through his bully pulpit, can actually voice opposition, as he has. to defunding the police. And I think we're starting to see some common sense breaking out, because if you look at a couple of the cities, for example, San Francisco's mayor, London Breed, or the newly elected mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, they've all begun to distance themselves from this idea of defund the police, even though in the past they sometimes pushed what I think would be some fairly radical ideas, and they still have some radical district attorneys that maybe need to be given a pink slip, but that is certainly an issue that needs to be addressed. Much of crime is state and local. The president still can have a bully pulpit to address those issues, and that's worth some conversation as well. One of the things that I thought was interesting in this piece is after the president said he was troubled by the empty chairs in American homes due to COVID-19. Good point. But what about the 100,000 empty chairs in America households due to narcotic overdoses, in particular fentanyl? And this brings us back to this whole idea of the border. I mean, apart from just the number of people crossing the border illegally, it's also drugs that are crossing the border. Now, China is the one that is actually shipping, for example, fentanyl or some of its other elements to Mexico, and then that's where the drug cartels use mules to transport it into California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and then it spreads out the rest of the country. So there would be a tendency sometimes to say, well, we want to stop drug trafficking from China at the ports. And I appreciate the president wanting to do that, but that's not where it's coming in from in large measure. It's coming across the border, and we probably need to do a program on some of that in the future. As you'll imagine, there were some of those social issues that you knew the president was going to address. One of those was the issue of abortion, because as we mentioned the other day on this program, the Women's Health Protection Act sounds real good, except basically what it would do is make Roe versus Wade the law of the land. It would overturn every single state law. It would eviscerate any kind of conscience protections. And, of course, he wants to push that through because he's looking at a Supreme Court that may actually overturn Roe versus Wade in the case known as Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. So he certainly was endorsing an abortion bill that even couldn't pass the United States Senate. But here's the issue. You need to see where your elected member of Congress is, because hundreds of those members of Congress in the House did actually vote for that. And dozens of them in the Senate would have voted for it if it had come to a vote, but it did not pass the issue of cloture, which prevented a filibuster. He, of course, also called repeatedly for the Equality Act passage. We've talked about that before on numerous occasions, encouraged you to write letters and contact your members of Congress about that. And, of course, we've even talked about it with Jim Dennison. The whole middle part of his book on the coming tsunami gets into that issue as well. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of drugs as well as guns. And the issue of guns, called for universal background checks. But I love this line. Why should anyone on a terrorist watch list be able to purchase a weapon? Well, okay, why haven't you actually, in the universal background check laws, expanded federal prohibitions to include the terrorist watch list? Okay, you have the ability probably to do that maybe even with an executive order. So again, some of these issues are ones that can generate response, emotion, the rest, but they aren't really based upon any kind of rational discussion. You can go on and on. Of course, we had quite a bit about climate change, and we will devote that to another day because it deserves a conversation unto itself. But I thought just as we wind down today, let me mention that my commentary is on inflation. Now, I didn't anticipate that when I wrote that a couple of weeks ago that I would want to focus on that today, other than to recognize that the president really didn't say much about it last night and really hasn't done much about it. And yet, if you look at the surveys that are done, it is very, very clear that indeed inflation is a problem, but I call it inflation ambivalence because for some people, inflation is good news. For example, if you're a homeowner, you can kind of pat yourself on the back and say, well, the price of my house is going up. It's really because the value of your dollar is going down, but you feel richer and you feel pretty good about that. If you're in the government and you hope to someday pay off our federal and national debt, which I doubt we're ever going to do, but if we did, we'd be paying off those dollars with devalued dollars, so that's a good thing. So, as much as American homeowners like rising prices, they don't like rising prices for their house, I should say. They don't like rising prices for gas and groceries and other staples. And that is, of course, a great concern because ultimately it hurts those who are middle class or the poor. I've been listening to some talk shows, and it's amazing how sometimes somebody will come on to a program, might be a Biden supporter, saying, I feel really good because I'm making more than I've ever made before, and the price of my house is going up. And since when was that the justification for actually allowing inflation to take place? If anything, if we said we really are concerned about people in the middle class and the poor who spend a much larger percentage, a much greater percentage for food, energy, and shelter, that is the case. And as of course we've pointed out on this program many times before, the consumer price index actually doesn't even come close to measuring some of the costs that the American families need to pay every month. So as we come to the end of even this State of the Union address, I point out in my commentary that it's not fair to say that inflation is due to Joe Biden, any more than it was fair to say that inflation was due to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter inherited inflation and inflationary pressures that existed even before him. But I also point out that even before Jimmy Carter was elected president, Joe Biden was elected senator. And so he only stood well back then and understands, I suspect right now, that even if he just inherited these inflationary pressures, it might not bode well for these midterm elections. And so we're going to start watching some of these elections. We just had one in Texas. Pretty soon, those of you in other states will be having your elections, and maybe we can begin to sense what is going to come in November. But I'll make a prediction that there are going to number of people that are voters who are going to go to the polls and express their displeasure with what has taken place so far. And it kind of brings us back to the first article that we mentioned. What a missed opportunity. President could have come up and said, there's a few things that we're going to change in 2022, lessons we learned from 2021. You know what? The American people are pretty forgiving, but they're not forgiving if you simply say, we're going to keep doing the same thing we've been doing before, because you all know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow we're going to spend some time talking about kind of the three worlds of evangelicalism. And then Michael Craven, our good friend, will be in studio. We'll talk about some of these worldview issues. And then, of course, don't forget our Friday weekend edition. Dr. Merrill Matthews Penedextra with us. And again, I want to thank Andrew and Gracie and Ivy for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here in Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have.
You're just absolutely fantastic.